Hi, welcome back. So I'm going to pick up where I left off in our last video, and I'm looking at chapter 4, and I'm starting from here. There was a problem with the corpses of the suicide bombers. So again, she starts with quite a provocative statement in that she has this really confronting image of the corpses of suicide bombers, and yet she phrases it in such a pragmatic way. So there was a problem with the corpses of the suicide bombers. They were piling up in steel refrigerators of Israel's morgue, and nobody could figure out what to do. The force of the blast eviscerates the middle part of the bomber's body, sending the head and feet sailing off into the air. So eviscerates means sort of rips out the insides. Now, all those salvaged heads and feet were jamming up the morgue, crowding out the dead Israelis. So all that's left of these suicide bombers are their heads and their feet. And there are so many heads and feet that have been collected and stored in the morgues that there is not enough room for Israelis, which is the priority for the Israeli government. Palestinians couldn't get into Israel to pick up their dead. They wouldn't dare come anyway, as the widow or mother of a bomber. So these remains aren't being collected, not because they don't want to collect their family member who is dead, but because they're afraid of what will happen to them if they admit that one of their family members was a terrorist. Under both Muslim and Jewish law, the body should have gone into the ground by first sundown after death, but many Jews were squeamish about burying a suicide bomber in the dirt of Israel. It came up on the floor of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the Attorney General struggled to invent a policy. But they came to no resolution, and the pile of heads and feet kept growing. So we have quite a grotesque image there of this pile, this mountain of heads and feet. Now, they weren't able to come up with a resolution because, one, they were squeamish, but two, any burial that they give would admit that these people deserved burial. They deserved the respect of being buried. And so to put that into a policy would mean acknowledging that these people who had committed these terrorist acts were actually human beings. I visited the morgue, met the director, and wrote a feature. Nothing long or fancy, just a surreal little glimpse of war warping the most ordinary corners of the country. So she doesn't see any problem with what she was typing. She believes she was just stating the facts of what was happening. The story ran, and then the hate mail began. So notice these really short sentences. It's sort of to create that sense of anticipation. Something's coming as a result of running this story. They called me stupid. They called me anti-Semite. They lashed me with language so bilious I felt uncomfortable reading the letters, as if a stranger had suddenly pulled down his pants to show me something private and deranged. So we have that repetition of they. And we also have phrases like anti-Semite, which means prejudice against Jews. But basically, they are so crude and uncomfortable, and so there are so many of these letters coming that she just feels completely confronted by them. One of them went on at ranting length about how the Palestinians were pigs who deserved to have their bodies soaked in pig's blood and burned. Now that's something that is quite interesting. It's sort of mentioned here, but it's also mentioned here. There's a lot of similarities between the Muslim and Jewish religions, and one of those similarities has to do with burial, and another of those similarities is that they both do not eat pork. And so this is a very confronting and disgusting, degrading thing to do to those body parts. Hundreds and hundreds of emails clogged my inbox. A right-wing pro-Israel website called Boycott the Los Angeles Times posted Megan Stack, another PLO propagandist, takes anti-Semitism to a level reminiscent of the 1930s. So they are so angry at this article that she's written about the corpses of the suicide bombers that they are saying she is writing things that are as bad as what was written before by the Nazi Party before they started rounding up the Jews. Everybody knows about the Jerusalem hate mail. All reporters get it. You think you are ready to read mail like that? You're not. Not at first. The smears are too personal. Again, we have those short sentences indicating the shock of what is happening. Suddenly, friends from home were saying, Mum saw this stuff about you on the internet. It's meant to be like that, personal and awkward, until you're so badgered that you catch yourself reading through the stories, not for truth or good writing, but weighing phrases, wondering how much hateful email they're going to incur. So they start to censor themselves to try and avoid all the hate mail that comes. So even though you might be writing the truth, you don't. The amount of hate mail that you could receive from writing the truth makes you censor yourself so that you wouldn't put in all the details that might upset someone. I hadn't expected it, not from a story so innocuous, even marginal. So she believed this to be a tiny little story that wasn't really important. Just a policy debate in Israel over a pile of old body parts. None of the Israeli staff in our bureau had been fazed or offended or even particularly interested. None of the facts were wrong. What was the big deal? So she's come from a place where you just report the facts, and if you keep the bias out of it, then there's nothing wrong with printing this. However, she's finding that in the midst of a place that's in conflict, you have to be really careful about the facts that you choose to expose. And here is the key phrase for this chapter. You humanized them, a reporter friend said. You're writing about suicide bombers as people who have corpses and families. They can't stand to see them written about like that. It's not like I said suicide bombers were good or noble, I said. It doesn't matter. You humanized them. And that's the key idea, that you can hate someone, you can attack someone and kill someone and feel okay about torturing someone as long as you think of them as the enemy rather than as another fellow human being. By 2003, I'd settled in Jerusalem and everybody was talking about a war in Iraq. By then, I was used to accepting vitriol and character attacks as another part of the war, and they had oxidized me. So vitriol means harsh, nasty words, and oxidize is sort of is a chemical reaction, but she's using it to say they'd hardened her. She didn't feel as emotional about the attacks that she was receiving. This was an old battle of narratives, all the stories fighting to be the most true. And as a writer of stories, you couldn't help getting dragged into it. I printed one of the emails and tacked it to my office wall. You and the LA Times should go fuck yourself. So she's included that phrase not to be coarse, but because she wanted to remind herself of how illogical and how rude they are being, that she shouldn't shape her writing to try and please people who would use that language against her. It was part of the crusting. So we have oxidized and crusting. It was part of the crusting you develop in Jerusalem. When the phone rang at 4 a.m, I fumbled for an instant coffee in a dark kitchen and hacked out a story about some fresh assault on Gaza, knowing even half asleep that nobody would read it, that many Americans don't fully understand what Gaza is, or how it was created, or what the presence of Israel tanks there denotes, and that the people most likely to slog through 20 column inches of wire-style reportage are the ones scanning for a hint of bias, a misplaced adjective, a mistaken fact. But I got up and wrote through the dawn all the same, because it was the job I'd pined after, and now it was mine in all its dubious glory. Work was becoming work. So she's writing this story to be published in Los Angeles, knowing that her American audience don't really understand what's happening in Gaza and probably don't even care what's happening in Gaza. They don't understand that having tanks in the Gaza Strip means that the Israelis are stripping more land away from the Palestinians. So the American audience wouldn't even really care, probably. The audience that does care is the Palestinian Israeli audience, and in particular it's the ones who are looking to attack her for being biased. They're looking for her to suggest that she supports the Palestinians. They're looking for her to write something that can be interpreted as her feeling sorry for the Palestinians, and they're looking for a mistake in her facts so that they can say her whole opinion about what's happening is biased or wrong because she made that little tiny mistake. Dubious means untrustworthy, unreliable. So she wanted this job, and yet it's become something that is unreliable in that she's censoring herself. So this thing that she had been all excited about had now just become work. Arab children could be trained to think better. Okay, so again, we have that provocative statement said as if it's matter of fact. Miri really thought so. So this idea that you can change the way other people think and that they should think the way that you think. That if they agree with you, then they are a better person. And so she's introducing this new character, Miri, here. She was an Israeli photographer with a rusty scrape of a voice and big dark eyes under torrents of wild curls. Miri was liberal. She believed in peace past the point when most Israelis had thrown up their hands and decided to build a wall. So liberal means she is quite open to change and is very progressive in the way she thinks. And when she's used this phrase here, when Megan Stack uses the phrase, they decided to build a wall, it's not just a physical wall that they have built, but a wall in their heads. So it's this whole thing about peace is too hard, so I'm just going to put a wall up in my mind and not think about it. Mary wasn't like that, however. She maintained what I imagined to be careful, fraught friendships with Israeli Arabs. So that's quite interesting. Mary is deliberately trying to be friends with Arabic people, as the Palestinians who live inside Israel proper are called. On my first trip, I annoyed the Jerusalem bureau chief by asking, but aren't there also Jewish Arabs, like Israelis from Morocco and Yemen? Yes, she snapped, but you don't call them that. So those Israelis, those Jewish people who lived in Palestine before it became Israel are Arabs. So they're Jewish Arabs. However, they don't call, Israelis don't refer to those original citizens of Palestine who are Jewish Arabs. They just call them Jewish. I was sitting around a television studio with Miri. Midnight was coming and we were eating sushi and talking about animals. Mary had been teaching Arab kids about animal rights, which is quite contradictory in that she's talking about animal rights and yet her country is stripping away human rights of these Arab children. It's terrible what you see, she said. They tie a cat or a dog to a stick and torture it, but you can explain to them. They don't know any better. So there's this idea that they are this group of people, that these Arab children are only behaving the way that they're behaving because they don't know any better. They need to be taught to think right, to think like the Jewish people. I was skeptical. I would think that either kids have compassion or not, I said, soaking a tuna roll in soy sauce. How can you put compassion where it wasn't before? Oh, you can, Mary said. They don't know. So you say, I have a cat at home and he's very smart. He does this and that. His name is Frank. So they start to think of a cat like a person with feelings. Do they respond, I asked. Yes, she said firmly. They are very interested. Israeli news was running. It was late in the new... So Mary is talking about pets and animal rights, and she's talking to children who are struggling to get food on their table and to get to school, and doesn't understand why they don't care about what she's talking about. But she's insisting that they do care. They are interested in animal rights. Israeli news was running. It was late in the newscast, in the features. There was a talent show in an Israeli prison. The prison looked jolly and clean. An inmate chatted with a voice coach. The two men joked back and forth, chuckling and nodding their heads. So this is a prison, and it's presented on this TV show, and they're doing a talent show within the prison. That's not where they put the Palestinians, I said. I had driven past the tents out in the desert, tried to get permission to pay a reporting visit and been denied. So, no, Mary said, that's for regular prisoners, criminals, not the Palestinians. So they are treating criminals better than they treat the Palestinians. So the criminals, the Jewish criminals, are kept in a prison that is jolly and clean, and they put on talent shows. Palestinian prisoners are kept in tents out in the desert and kept away from news and TV so that Israeli people don't see what's happening to them, which is quite ironic when you think about what happened in World War II with the hiding away of what they were doing to the Jewish prisoners, the Jewish people that they'd put in the camps, that they were keeping away from the public eye. This is what they are doing with the Palestinian prisoners. They're keeping it out of the public eye so that they can't be reported on. They're not in the news cycle. They're not in publications, and people aren't seeing what's happening. Because if people were seeing what's happening, they'd start to care and they'd start to draw those comparisons for themselves. I watched for another minute. Men were prancing on stage. It looks very nice, I said. They try to be humane, she agreed. And so what Megan is noticing is the hypocrisy of it all, of the way that they are putting on this show and pretending that they are so humane and nice to prisoners, when really she knows that it's not as nice as they're pretending it is. On the map, Nablus was right up the road. It seemed all you had to do was drive to the Israel town of Kfar Saba, hang a right, and cruise to Nablus. The trouble with the geography of the occupied Palestinian territories, however, is that maps are misleading. Space yawns and vanishes. Checkpoints and closures crop up and disappear again. There are some roads for settlers and other roads for Arabs, and woe unto the unlucky driver who confuses his way. But on this day, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I wanted to visit a family in Nablus, and I was going by the map. I just want to make a point here. So you have within that territory, let me show you. Within this territory here, you have different roads that Palestinians use, and roads that Israelis will use, and there's actually signs on the roads warning Israelis not to use that road, and those warnings are there because they can't protect them from being attacked if they are caught using those roads. It's unsafe, and so there's actually signs indicating that. So that's what the checkpoints and closures crop up and disappear again are about. So there's also a distinct difference between the quality of the roads. So Israel puts money into creating roads and creating infrastructure. And so if it's a road for settlers, for other Jewish Israelis, then the roads are usually really well maintained. They're tarred, they're solid roads. Roads that are for the Arabs have not been maintained and updated. They don't get any money for that sort of infrastructure, and so they're quite ruddy and bumpy, and you'll see trash on the sides of the roads because they don't have the sanitation money to collect that rubbish. I'd met this family back in 2002 when Nablus was under Israeli closure, and we'd had to drive a twisting, dusty path through the olive groves, hiding from the Israeli tanks to reach their house. I hadn't seen the family since then, and I had no particular errand with them now, but I wanted to visit this town, whose name Palestinians spoke with soft smiles, asking if you'd tried the honey-dripping kanafe, if you visited the olive oil soap factories. So it was quite a fond place, a nice, calm place. Well, it used to be. And now I found myself in Kfar Saba, spinning around grassy traffic circles and trolling the back streets, sense of direction scrambled, in the absurd position of looking for the West Bank in Israel. So even though these two towns neighbour each other, they have no connection. There's no way to go straight from one town to the next. She's right next to the West Bank, and yet she doesn't know how to get into the West Bank. We know that it is a Jewish Israeli place because there's grass. It's green. There's water to water the grass. Understand, Kfar Saba is right next to the West Bank. Imagine driving around El Paso discovering that nobody knows where Mexico is. It seems logically impossible, except you keep slamming into it, this blank unknowing. I pulled over and asked some kids on bikes. Empty stares, suspicious frowns. An old man at the roadside shook his head. The mechanics at the gas station weren't really certain either. So she's asking for directions to an Arabic town, and so kids have no idea what she's talking about. Empty stares. They're suspicious because she wants to go to an Arabic town. They're giving her no help. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to help her. It's because if you lived in Israel and weren't a settler, you could block the West Bank out of your mind. You'd have no business going there, and so you could simply remove it from consideration. Looking for the crossing in this sleepy Israel community was like hunting for a gap in time and space, the gateway to another dimension. In the end, somehow, I found the checkpoint that marked the line between Israel and West Bank. And so here it becomes really clear that separation between the two communities, even though they're living in the same space, they are distinctly different to the point where they don't even interact, to shop, to go to school, for anything. There's no reason for them to go to each other's towns. The soldiers let the armoured car through, except the road didn't go the way the map suggested, and soon I hit another checkpoint. By now I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields of dead grass. I let the car shudder to a stop and took in the scene before me. About 20 Palestinians stood listlessly in a neat line, waiting their turn to be searched and interrogated so they could continue along the country road. So I want you to picture this. Imagine you were driving from Shepparton to Dookie, and all of a sudden there's a checkpoint and you have to get out of your car. You have to line up. You have to line up for hours in the hot sun for them to search you and interrogate you and ask you what you're doing. These people with guns, before letting you continue along that country road that's going nowhere to Dookie. This is what they would do, and they would just pop up anywhere that they felt like putting a checkpoint. They stood on a line to nowhere, all spiffed up because they had some place to be. They were mostly old men, their patched polyester blazers and stiff shoes coated in dust from walking the dirt trails out of their villages and scrambling over sand berms. They stood there like something out of an absurdist painting, as if they were queued up at a turnstile or a ticket office. So it's like they're queued up to get into something when really they're just queued up to continue along the road. As if they'd been cut out of a city block and pasted over these golden fields. A small cluster of Israeli soldiers in olive fatigues administered the checkpoint. They were in their teens, or just out of them. They sneered at the Palestinians and horsed around among themselves, so they're mucking around and they're being really rude to the people in the line. One of them sauntered over to the car, gun in hand. So the description that she's using of the Israeli soldiers is a description of arrogance. I shoved open the heavy armoured door. The shatterproof window didn't roll down. The soldier looked like a child to me. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm a journalist. I'm trying to get to Nablus." "You can't go down this road." "Why not?" "You can't go." "Is it a closed military zone?" "Because if it's not a closed military zone, I can go." He just stood there and smirked. So they're stopping people from going along this country road simply because they feel like it. There is no reason other than to annoy the people who they wish would leave their what they consider to be their country. So they do this to annoy the Palestinians. I felt like informing him that I was an American taxpayer, that my family and I had been compelled to pay for his guns and tanks and jeeps, his salary, to the detriment of schools and homeless shelters and other miscellaneous things in our own country, that his country would surely have been overrun by hostile Arabs long ago without the billions of US tax dollars pumped into the Israeli military, that I understood that's what we'd collectively chosen to do with our money, and I didn't expect him to thank me, but that he could at least wipe the smirk off his teenaged face, because every time I went to Gaza or the West Bank and saw his colleagues harassing old, sickly Palestinians with the same youthful vigour with which old, sickly Jews had been tormented in Europe, I wanted to burn my notebooks and join a Buddhist monastery someplace. So she is drawing a direct comparison to the arrogance that these Israeli soldiers are treating these poor old men who are just trying to travel from one place to another in their own land. They're treating them the same way that the Nazis treated the Jews and tormented the Jews. That I didn't want to be staring at him and thinking these acutely uncomfortable thoughts. All I wanted was a small and theoretically simple experience, to drive down the miserable road and pay a visit to a miserable family a few miserable miles away. So we have that repetition of miserable, 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 that it should be something that is simple, to just go and visit friends. Should be a simple act, and yet they are deliberately making it hard, just for the fun of it. I didn't say any of that. I just glared, feeling anger boil in my face. And so as an American who is just living here and wanting to visit just out of interest, she's getting frustrated. Can you imagine how frustrating it is for those Palestinian people who actually live there? The soldier did not let me through. I had to turn around and drive back the other way, plunge off into the West Bank and lose myself in the maze of roads. By the time I reached Adib's house, a cold dusk was gathering in the streets. I'd have to drive back after dark. I was tired. My bones ached from jouncing over the broken roads. Dust matted my hair and streaked my face. I drank the tea his wife brought, struggling for small talk. They hadn't been out of Nablus in months. They smiled strange smiles and had almost nothing to say. Had I heard that the Israelis destroyed some of the famous soap factories? Yes, I'd heard. Well then, well. My family is fine, thank you. It was like a prison visit. Less than an hour later, I was headed back to Jerusalem. I got on a settler highway back, and the ride was smooth and fast. So, the conversation is strained because they know there's nothing she can do to help them. Well then, well, there's this sense of helplessness and resignation that this is what life is for them, and there's nothing she can do about it. So she's just described the roads, broken, dusted roads, and now she's describing the settler highway back and how smooth and fast it is. She's contrasting these two existences. It was dark, late and cold when I got back to my little stone apartment in the old Israeli artist colony. Lying in bed, I felt the heaviness of melancholy inside my chest, like a small spot of deadness, a Palestinian cancer. So melancholy is like a deep sadness. We have the simile and metaphor combination again here to describe that feeling of sadness, overwhelming sadness, feels like death inside of her, like a Palestinian cancer, that lump within her. The entire West Bank was withering away, choked off by occupation. It was nothing but roads you couldn't take, checkpoints you couldn't pass, the spots of troubled Arab tourists laced into the network of settler roads and settler towns, like flies tangled in a spider's web. Who was everybody kidding? Where was a Palestinian state going to come from? There was no solid piece of land. The maps around here didn't mean a thing. So she's saying, how can there possibly be peace between Palestine and Israel when there is no solid grouping of land left that you could say this is Palestine? The Israeli government and citizens had been eroding every spare bit of land and putting themselves in there so that there's no possibility of a united area that is just Palestinian. However, given all of this, she still begins the next part. I loved living in Israel. That was the hardest part. I loved it. Every time I climbed the dry heights of Masada and felt the desert wind and saw the Dead Sea gleam below like spilled ink. I remember restaurants in Tel Aviv, the cliffs of Jaffa, a few sticky summer mornings when I woke up with the sun and drove to the shore to swim, watching the old men splash their flabby forearms, opening themselves to the Mediterranean like weary bears come out from winter hiding. I loved the music that dripped from the clubs on gritty summer nights in Tel Aviv, the darkened streets and young bodies and the sexiness of it all, the intensity of youth and desire against the backdrop of war. But you went to the West Bank or Gaza and saw the way the Palestinians lived, and it ruined everything. So we have this contrast. You realized it was rotten underneath. So all of these things that she loved all of these freedoms and excitement of it all that she was enjoying, all was based on the destruction of Palestine. That all of these things existed because they had taken Palestine away and kicked out everyone. I could be in Herzliya eating buttery sea bream and drinking mojitos on a terrace over the beach, watching the sun set the Mediterranean skies on the fire and the children kick at the edge of blackening waters, hearing the voices of mothers, the shush of waves, the pulse of music playing somewhere. But inside of me was the corruption of memory, knowing the underbelly of the state, thinking about what all of the people around me were determined to ignore. It made everything filthy. So she couldn't, hopefully you noticed that really long sentence there, where she's describing all those things that she loved. And then she says it's all filthy. It all exists because of the corruption of the place. And everyone is determined to ignore that corruption. And it makes everything dirty and filthy. The bombings were huge and awful, but the suffering of the Palestinians was chronic, dripping through the days like acid. So we have the simile there. All of the small horrors that get washed away from a distance, that never make the news, but are the grains of earth in that place. So we have the metaphor there. The Palestinian cancer patients who were not allowed to leave the Gaza Strip for treatment, the Palestinian mothers who gave birth at checkpoints, the people who hadn't seen their families for years, the shepherds who led their flocks accidentally into the wrong spot and got blown away. The Palestinian American woman who came to visit her family one summer and got stuck because the Israelis wouldn't give her a permit to drive back to the airport, because even Palestinians with American passports are treated like plain old Palestinians once they set foot inside Israel. The settlers who ransacked the olive groves, the market stalls and greenhouses torn down. The occupation was a cloud of punishment that raged in times of suicide bombings and in times of quiet, a few miles away, invisible. And so here we have the metaphor. At the time, the Palestinians drew my attention most of all, because their culture was the most foreign, because they were killed far more often, and yet their slaughter was treated more casually, packing lower news value, because they were trapped both by Israel and by their own leaders, their own killers. But I am haunted now by Israelis, by the overlay of realities, the way they knew and didn't know. And that reminds me of World War II, how the German people knew what was happening to their Jewish neighbours, and yet they didn't know. They chose to ignore it. They lived right next door, there and not there. They ignored it, or they told themselves stories that made it all right. Horrible stories, and worst of all, the stories were true, the injustice and blood of Jewish history. So they excuse what they are doing to the Palestinians because of the horrible injustice that they suffered in World War II. They believe that makes it okay for them to do what they are doing to these people. And yes, Israel has a reason for everything, and there is a national myth that theirs is the most humane army in the world. But in Jerusalem, I learned that good intentions and lofty ideals are almost the most dangerous tools of all in a war, because they blind people to what they are doing, to the blood on their hands. So she is saying that this belief that they are good people, that they are doing the right thing, blinds them to the actual harm that they are creating. And she's saying that's worse than the bombs and the guns. One morning, I got to work early and found nobody there except Abby, the office manager. Abby was hyperactive and giggly and screechy. She wore crazy socks and wild clothes in orange, purple, and lime green, and she brought us little treats like chocolate chip cookies and peanut butter. She had 3 kids at home, but she never seemed tired or down. At least, she hadn't until today. So all of this description here is to show us that this is a really peppy, happy person. And she's walked in and this happy person is looking really tired at the moment. Abby had seen a documentary on Israeli television the night before. It was about impoverished Palestinian children who picked a living out of a garbage dump near Hebron, waiting for trucks to haul in the trash of Israeli settlers. The kids combed the settlers' garbage, looking for scraps of edible food, foraging for clothes, hunting for a living. The settler garbage was the best, the kids said, because the Palestinians don't have much to throw away. Abby had tears in her eyes. Abby had never been in the territories, and she seldom talked about politics, but now she wanted to know if what she had seen was true. So even though Abby had lived in Israel and lived beside these people, she'd never actually gone and seen what it looked like. And she was confronted with something that she'd never actually spent the time to think about. It was just like the ghetto, she said quietly. Is this true? Is this what we've come to? Our families left Poland because of these things, and now we are doing the same to other people? Well, I said uncomfortably, I've never seen that place, but I've heard about it. The situation is not good there. I know, she said, swiping at her eyes. Oh my God, what's going to happen to us? So she's come to the realization that they are the bad guys in this situation, that her family who had fled this sort of treatment were now doing it to others. She's just realized that she does not have the moral high ground in this situation. After September 11, many Israelis said to the Americans, now you know what terror means. And soon the United States too had an occupation of its own, and then a second occupation. We lived even further away from our wars. Israel built a fence, we had an ocean. And so Megan's drawing the comparison here that Israel is not the good guy in this situation, and she is saying neither is America. That Israel ignores what they are doing by building a fence. America ignores what they were doing to hurt other people because they were so far away. They had an ocean to block the view of what they were doing. The comparison was there. Some Israelis wanted badly to believe they could be all right one day, in spite of the anguish in their backyard. Others were hardened beyond caring. They ignored it as best they could, sealed themselves inside Israel. But it was always there. As the infidel grew more violent, the use of sedatives rose. Infidel is the name they used for the uprisings, the riots of the Palestinian people. So as the riots grew more violent, the use of sedatives rose, and more Israeli husbands battered and killed their wives. Soon a spike of suicides and rapes among American soldiers would tell the statistical story of our own trauma. You can overcome the things that are done to you, but you cannot escape the things that you have done. Key idea there. So they had, because of the pain that they had inflicted on these other human beings, they were taking that trauma home, and it was causing violence back in their own communities. Israeli men were beating and killing their own wives. American soldiers were coming back to America, and there was a spike in suicides and rapes in America. They couldn't leave the guilt and the pain of what they had done to other people behind. They took it back with them. Here is the truth. It matters what you do in war. It matters more than you ever want to know. Because countries, like people, have collective consciences and memories and souls. And the violence we deliver in the name of our nation is pulled like sickly tar at the bottom of who we are. I just love the way she has summarized that statement, that we as a collective nation cannot escape the things that we do to other people. It shapes what our nation becomes, the things that our nation values. The soldiers who don't die for us come home again. They bring with them the killers they became on our national behalf, and sit with their polluted memories and broken emotions in our homes and schools and temples. We may wish it were not so, but action amounts to identity. We become what we do. You can tell yourself all the stories you want, but you can't leave your actions over there. You can't build a wall and expect to live on the other side of memory. All of that poison seeps back into our soil. She's saying that we as a nation become broken, even though these things are happening so far away that we don't see it. It is still breaking us. It's still affecting us. We bring all of that pain back onto our own communities. And it makes us lie to ourselves, precisely because we want to believe that we are good. We do not want to interrupt a noble national narrative. So we don't want to tell ourselves the truth that we might be doing the wrong thing. But there are things we try to obscure by talking about terrorism, things we do to others and to ourselves. Only the most hawkish Israelis say that they are oppressing people in order to take away their land. So, very few Israelis will admit that they are doing these things to the Palestinians in order to take that land. Many won't actually put it that way, and they don't want to admit that that's actually what's happening. Instead, they tell themselves stories. There are other stories to tell, other ways to frame and explain military campaigns. Israelis are looking for security. They are fighting terror. It is ugly, but they have no choice. Every nation needs its stories. So remember at the start of this chapter, those constant references to stories. That's a motive that carries through this whole chapter. Never more so than in times of war. And so the Israelis tell themselves they are making the desert bloom, and that they are the only democracy in the Middle East, a humane land that is sometimes forced to behave inhumanely. And we Americans tell ourselves that we are fighting tyranny and toppling dictators, and we say this word, terrorism, because it has become the best excuse of all. We push into other lands, we chase the ghosts of a concept because it is too hard to admit that evil is already in our own hearts and blood is on our hands. And so she ends the chapter with that statement, this idea that we use the word terrorism as an excuse for what we are doing to other countries. All right, so I'll leave it there. I hope this has helped you understand the chapter and appreciate the beauty of the writing a bit more. And good day.